He believes he's told us all the stories. So we must prove him wrong and find stories we haven't been told.
And here's a good question, I think. Someone said, as a linguistic aficionado themselves, I'm very interested in real life. How did your formative linguistic training and your own research as a linguist influence your thought process and design choices in creating Klingon? Both for the films and subsequently.
Well, it was for the films initially. Film. There was one film, then the book, then more films. The main thrust of my linguistic research, besides general stuff, was on an American Indian language from California that at the time I was working on it had 0 speakers. So all of my research was based on documentation written down by anthropologists who'd visited with the last couple of speakers, or missionaries from 200 years before that, and stuff like that. So I was working with a language that nobody knew, okay, except for what was in this documentation. And when I started to work on Klingon, I was again working with a language that nobody knew. So I was already used to that, so to speak. But I didn't have documentation to go to. I had to go to me for the same thing. But it was the same kind of thing. It was like, what can I figure out? When working on the real language, the Indian language, because Klingon's a real language, I had no control over the data. Okay, I had sheets of paper with stuff written on it, and it would work like this. This particular anthropologist who did a lot of work liked really big paper for some reason. If he only had 4 words on it, sometimes he'd fill it out, but sometimes just like a few words on the top, and then go to another page. So it worked a lot like this. There'd be a page, and what it would say is "I walk," say, and then in the Indian language the same thing. I'll turn the page. You walk. All right, he's getting somewhere. We walk. Good. Turn the page. It's hot outside. Where's they walk? What? Okay. It was so I could only deal with what I got. Was what was in front of me. And with Klingon, it was kind of the same way in that all I could deal, all I chose to deal with maybe, was what's in the script. If it's in the script, we had to come up with something. Had to come up with words for that. Had to come up with grammar for that. If it wasn't in the script, who cares at the beginning? So it was the same kind of thing. This is what I've got. This is all I've got. Stop. Okay. For the Indian language point of view, I had several boxes of these kinds of papers, and I knew. This was in Berkeley. Okay, and I knew that there was more boxes, a lot more boxes, at the Smithsonian in Washington. But I was in Berkeley, and I had the boxes in Berkeley. From a dissertation writing point of view, this was really good, because when I got through the boxes, I knew I was done. If I was in Washington, I'd probably never be done, because there was so much stuff. So that was good. That was the same thing with Klingon. When I got to the end of the script, I knew I was done. I didn't know there was going to be more. I didn't know there was going to be revisions. I didn't know there was going to be post-production. But I thought, oh, I'm done, and here. So my linguistic experience, my research experience, it was very much similar in a weird way to the Klingon.
So at any point did you were given lines, like they wanted you to just translate lines. At any point were you like, I'm just going to translate these lines and not worry about actually creating a full length?
No. From the outset.
That was your choice?
Discussions.
Was that your choice?
It was my choice, but discussions with Harv Bennett, who was the producer. And writer, I guess he was the main writer on that movie. So, yeah. Yeah, we decided we wanted it to be a real language. We wanted it to sound real, so the way to do that is make it real.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did you get tapped to be the linguist on Star Trek rather than somebody else?
How did I get I don't know if anyone else, the Discord people, could hear him.
I think they could. Okay. The little box lighted up, but you can always repeat the question if you...
The short version is, how did I get to do all of this stuff in the first place? Most of the people in this room know this story backwards and forwards.
Let's again.
Let's see if it's the same this time. Well, my background is linguistics, so that's relevant to the thing, but that's part of it. My regular job for years and years and years was not Klingon, that didn't exist yet, right? It was closed captioning. And I worked in for those who are in Europe or something, closed caption. I think you guys just call it subtitling, but it was for deaf people. It was not for translation. And I worked on closed captioning from before it was on the air in America, so from the very, very beginning. And for the first few years, we could only caption programs that were on film or on tape, where we could get a copy of it ahead of time and watch it, push play, hear a line, hit pause, type in what you heard, hit play, pause, type in what you heard. It was more complicated than that, but that was basically what you would do.
All that kind of stuff.
But we couldn't do anything live. So we couldn't do news, we couldn't do sports. And we finally figured out a way to do that and experimented with it a bit. And then we decided, okay, we're ready to go live with the live. And we contacted various people, and the decision was made that the first program we would do live, Caption Live, should be a program that had high publicity value and relatively low probability of error, just in case it wasn't as good as we thought it was. So we picked the Oscars. The publicity value is obvious with the Oscars. And in fact, on the Oscars, they announced this closed caption for the first time, The low probability of error is big secret that everyone knows. The Oscars are scripted, right? When they get up there and say, the job of the cinematographer is to bring life to they're just reading a teleprompter. So we could get the script ahead of time, put it in a computer, and the only part that we have to do really, really live is when they say, and the Oscar goes to so-and-so, I'd like to thank my mother and father and dog and all that stuff, right? So everybody said okay, the Academy said it's okay, and ABC was the network, they said okay. And they said, we'll give you a script ahead of time, about a week ahead of time, but it keeps changing. Every day there's revisions, so somebody has to keep track of this so you're sure that you have the latest version of the script all the time for your final thing. So somehow or other I was picked to be the person who was going to keep track of all of this. This was in 1982. Half of the people in this room probably weren't born yet. I don't know about the people on the computer.
Probably half of them weren't born yet either.
We didn't have a lot of stuff then. I don't even know if we had fax machines then. I mean, they were invented, but I don't know if we had them. And we certainly didn't have the internet and blah, blah, blah. So all of this stuff had to be done in Los Angeles, where the Oscars were. So they flew me out to LA a week ahead of time to get this paper script. And I called up whoever I'm supposed to call, the Academy or somebody. And they said, great, welcome to LA. We'll have something for you on Wednesday night or Thursday morning. And this was a Monday. So I had Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday with nothing to do, which was fine with me. That was okay. I grew up in Los Angeles, so my family is there. And friends are there. But I hadn't called any of my friends ahead of time because I didn't want to say, guess what? I'm in Los Angeles and I have absolutely no time to see you. I can stay home and do that. But suddenly I had time. So I got on the phone and started calling a few friends. And one of my friends said, where are you? Where are you calling me from? So I said where I was. And she said, oh, that's like a mile from here. Why don't you come by for lunch? Okay, come by for lunch. Well, that meant where she works. She worked at Paramount Pictures. Her boss was Harv Bennett, who was the producer of Star Trek II, which was in post-production at that time. And I knew him, too, from a long time ago. So I knew I had two friends working on Star Trek. That's all I knew absolutely nothing more than that. So anyway, she and I and another woman who was working on the show went out to lunch in the Paramount Commissary, which sounds very romantic. Paramount Commissary has two sides. I don't know if it does now. I haven't been there for years. It has two sides. There's the restaurant side, which is with the white tablecloths and movie stars and all that. And there's the cafeteria side with the gaffers and the best boys. That's where we went. And some extras. You do see people in funny costumes in there sometimes. And during the lunch conversation, the woman who I hadn't met before said, oh, I understand you have a degree in linguistics. I said, yeah. She said, that's very interesting because we've been in touch with the linguistics department at UCLA recently. And I said, why? That's odd. I've been in linguistics departments. Phones don't ring. In fact, in Berkeley, they took the phones away. a problem. I think that was a budget thing. But anyway,
Talking would be something that...
well, no,
linguists
cell
would-
phones came.
Oh,
Anyway,
okay.
she said, well, there's a scene in Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, where Mr. Spock and this new female Vulcan character, right, named Sophic, have a short little conversation. Life has really changed because they were just happy to tell me this stuff. Anyway, they have a short little conversation. Right, didn't sign anything. Had a short little conversation. The two characters have a short conversation. And when they did the filming, they were speaking English because the script said to do that. But now they're in post-production, and for interesting reasons that I'll come back to, they decided they wanted to change this into Vulcan, have them speaking Vulcan, and then put in subtitles because something happened so the original dialogue didn't make sense anymore. And they figured the easiest way to fix this is to dub in gobbledygook, okay, and then put in subtitles that meant what they wanted it to say. So the plan was to have this linguist, I don't know who it was, from UCLA come over and watch the scene, look at their lips, figure out something that they could say that matched the lips but sounded different, okay, and then dub it in like you're doing a foreign film. And go from there. And I said, that's really smart. That's very clever. That's a really good idea. And hiring a linguist makes sense because they understand what you do to make noises and all that. And she said, yeah, we thought it was a good idea too, but it's turned into a headache. This is 40-something years ago. I don't remember what the headache was all about. I do remember it was a boring headache. And what I mean by that, they're playing phone tag. Remember phone tag? Or something like that. Just things weren't working out easily. She said, I don't know what we're going to do. We have to have this taken care of right away. And I said, what do you mean right away? Got to be done by the end of this week, which is exactly how long I was in time for the Oscars. So I said, I can do that. Because I've been thinking, once they told me, I was thinking what I would do if I were going to do it, not thinking I was going to do it. And my friend said, yeah, he can do that. He's got the same kind of degrees as those people at UCLA do. At that point, the associate producer happened to walk by. They turned to him and said, we just solved the Vulcan problem. And he said, what do you mean? So they told him, and he said, come see me after lunch. So that's how that happened. Now, the fact that I knew Harv Bennett is not irrelevant to the story, because it was ultimately his decision whether to hire me or not. So he wasn't hiring somebody that he never heard of. Right, but that's not what I went there for. I went there for a sandwich.
Go for a sandwich, get a language.
Right. So that's what I mean. And then a year and a half or 2 years later, whatever it was, when we were making Star Trek III, Harv called and said, well, we're making another movie, and the villains are going to be the Klingons. I think, meaning Harv thinks, they should have their own language. You did Vulcan. Do you want to do Klingon? So that's how that happened. Oh, that was a very different approach, obviously, because that wasn't gobbledygook. That was going to be thought about, should have been more carefully, obviously. But anyway, that's how.
But the Vulcan was just pure gobbledygook.
The Vulcan was pure gobbledygook, and not unprecedented. Okay, in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the very beginning of the movie is Klingon, right? And that was made up, that Klingon, let's come back to Klingon. Okay. After that scene is Vulcan. They're on the Vulcan planet, and Spock is undergoing a ritual. He's being inducted, if that's the right word, into Kolinar, and you just get rid of all your non-logic and this stuff. And that scene was filmed with the actor speaking English. Spock doesn't talk at all. It's this woman, priestess or whatever she is, conducting this ceremony. She's got a helper. And she does most of the talking. He has maybe one line or two. And all of that was in English. And then afterwards, once they're in post-production and stuff, they said they didn't like it. I don't know why they didn't like it. I don't know if they didn't like that. They didn't. I don't know if they didn't like it because it was in English, or they didn't like the performance, but they didn't like it. And then they got to thinking, this is taking place on the planet Vulcan. There's nobody there except Vulcans. It's an old Vulcan ceremony. Why are they talking English? And they knew the relevant part. The reason they even thought that is because they knew that, although it hadn't been filmed yet, that there was going to be Klingon talking in Klingon. So the idea of another language was already floating around. So they hired a linguist from UCLA, not from the linguistics department, but from whatever department taught Sanskrit and things like that, some South Asian something department, named Harmut Sharf. And he came over and did exactly the same as I did, except he did it first, which is watch the scene, make up some gobbledygook, okay, that matched the lips. When they're off camera, he could do whatever he wanted, right? And when they're on camera, it had to match the lips. And then they dubbed it in and put subtitles. And so the voices, the two voices you hear are not the voices of the people you see. Okay, they hired a different woman to be the woman. And I think Sharf himself, I was told, but I don't know this, I can't confirm it, was the voice of the guy. But anyway, he was also, Sharf, tasked with creating Klingon initially, and he did. So Sharf is the guy who did Klingon initially for Star Trek: The Motion Picture, but they didn't like it. It just sounded too. He was German. It sounded either too German or too Hindi or something, because he specialized in those languages there. So they kind of, I don't know if they totally threw out everything he did, but basically started all over again. And then the people who did it, who were tasked with doing it again, was two people. It was a producer named John Poville and an actor named James Doohan, right, Scotty. And the two of them came up with this stuff. And Poville describes it as the goal was to come up with screeches and hisses and noises and stuff like that, and don't talk about vocabulary or grammar or anything. And then people know this story too, and it all ends up in Lawrence's garage. But anyway, the end of this story. They wrote it out or recorded it on something, and then gave it to the actor who was supposed to say these lines, who is Mark Leonard, right, who is normally Sarek, Spock's father. And he wrote out the lines in a way that made sense to him. And then they filmed all this stuff. And they filmed a lot more, actually, than what's in the film. The film, there's half a dozen lines or something. But in normal movie thing, that, there's more. The reason I said end up in Lawrence's garage, and correct me if I'm saying anything wrong here. It's in the basement. It's in the basement, okay. Is the reason I found out about this in the first place is because during the filming of Star Trek 3, because I was on set for Star Trek 3 every time a Klingon talked, almost, not every time, but almost. I was hanging around on the Genesis planet one day. And when you make a movie, it takes a long time, because there's a lot of nothing to do. And on the Genesis planet, it took even longer than normal, because normally when you make a movie, you film out of sequence. Everything that takes place in this place, regardless where it comes to the movie, you do it at the same time, and then you move somewhere else and do it for something. But for the Genesis planet, they had to film it in plot order, because the Genesis planet was falling apart. So they would film something, and then they would stop and take it apart a little bit, and then film the next thing, stop, take it apart a little bit more. So they had to film it in that order, right, and be very careful taking apart and so on. So it was a lot of time filming on the Genesis planet. And I was hanging around there one day while they were destroying it. And there's this guy standing next to me, and I looked over, and it was Mark Leonard, right? It's Sarek. And I recognized him. He had no reason to recognize me, but we introduced ourselves to each other or something, and he said, "Hi, I'm Mark." I said, "Hi, I'm Mark." So we bonded instantly. And he said, "What are you doing here?" So he didn't phrase it like that. So I told him, he said, I spoke Klingon in that first movie. I said, "Yeah, I know." And he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a piece of paper with Klingon lines written out. It was his script that he wrote for the first movie. I didn't have access to that. When I made a Klingon, I went back to the first movie so I could get, base it a little bit on those lines. But he had it written out there, and I looked, and I said, "Yeah, that's very familiar looking." I misunderstood that. But anyway, and a whole lot more. And I'm thinking, what's all this other stuff? But he had that. And he told me basically the story that I just told you about how it was created. Years go by, and it's the something or other anniversary of Star Trek, some year that ended with a 5 or a 0 anniversary of Star Trek. And the Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian in Washington had a big Star Trek exhibit. And they figured it was going to be popular. So they got a whole bunch of volunteered docents, I don't know, people to help with the crowds. And the thing was there for however long it was there, a couple, 3 months. And at the end, they had a big party for all these volunteers who were helping out. And I was invited to the party just because I was there. I didn't do anything. And I knew ahead of time that there's going to be 2 guests at the party. One of them was Mark Leonard, and they announced that ahead of time. And the other one was Majel Barrett. But that was a secret. She was going to be a surprise guest. So we go to this thing, and there's all, it's in the great, if you've been into the Air and Space, there's a big giant IMAX theater there, and that's where it was. And the people in charge thanking all the volunteers and honoring so-and-so, and here's a special certificate, all that stuff. And here's Mark Leonard. And Mark gets up and talks a little bit, and he's telling jokes and telling stories and stuff, and he's supposed to introduce Majel. Well, I happened to be sitting in the front row and could hear people kind of whispering to Mark, she's not here, keep going. So he talks some more and talks some more. She's still not, everyone knew she was in town. Mm-hmm. They'd seen her, but she wasn't there. Keep going. And he finally ran out of steam, couldn't think of what else to do. And then he looked in the audience and says, oh, look who's here. And he pulls me up on stage and says, this is Mark that he made Klingon. And he reaches into his pocket and pulls out this piece of paper, and he says, I'll say the line in Klingon and you tell me what it means. And remember, this is the lines from the movie, but also all this other stuff, okay, right, which is actually in the movie, but you can't hear it because it's on a view screen and there's other dialogue going on, or at least some of it is. And so he said, wejmaH or something, I could deal with that. And there's all this other stuff. Fortunately, at that point, Majel showed up. So it was safe. Years go by, and Lawrence, now that I'm telling your story, so I'll probably screw it up. Lawrence is on one of the Star Trek cruises, and one of the guests on the Star Trek cruise is Mark Leonard. And Lawrence and Mark got to know each other and are together talking about this, that, and the other thing. Something about memory, is that right? And
Mark was having some memory issues that go with aging, and I said, well, we were on a separate snorkeling visit. And on the way back, I said, I'm a psychologist. I can give you some pointers that will help you hold on to what you've got.
Right. So anyway, so they had this discussion. Mark was very happy to hear all that, and he decided he would thank Lawrence. And the way he thanked him is he reached into his pocket and pulled out this piece of paper and gave it to Lawrence. So Lawrence has it, apparently in the basement, right?
Can we get a scan of that, please?
His head.
And his head. You have his head too, right? Yeah.
Why do I have strange feelings that a head is going to show up on my doorstep?
Hide in your bed.
Heavily insured.
Did Mark know that Lawrence was the head of the KLI?
Oh, sure.
Or you at that
Yeah.
point?
Yeah.
Because we jumped ahead a lot in
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. Why did I talk about that?
It was all about how you got involved in this, and
Yeah.
so let me see. Anybody here got questions? Sure.
When you did the Vulcan and you had to match the lip movement, how did you present that so that the actors would say it right and get the lip movements right? We know how with Klingon it often doesn't come out as you.
Well, I was there.
Okay.
The
Let me rephrase the question.
the famous. Huh?
I'm just going to.
Okay.
The question was, if I get this right, how did Mark make sure that the speakers of Vulcan got the lip movements right so that it would match the recording and all the sounds and all that kind of stuff?
So this fateful lunch was on a Monday. Okay.
Run,
Right.
run.
On, I think it was Tuesday, it might have been Wednesday, but no later than that. I think it was Tuesday, I went back. They gave me the lines on Monday, the English lines. Or maybe they actually showed it to me. No, they showed me the film. They showed me the film because, I wrote down what they were saying in English, but also looked at their lips to see if I could take advantage of anything that they were doing with their mouth that you couldn't hear. And Leonard Nimoy did. Okay, there was 2 lines apiece. She said something, he said something, she said something, he said something. That's it. But at the end of his 2 lines, at the end of Leonard Nimoy's 2 lines, he closed his mouth. Now, that sounds silly to say, but what that meant, he went blah, 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 blah. Aha, so when I make up his stuff, the last syllable is right? So yeah, he says that blah, 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 Savik, but it comes out that Savikam, right? So it's the case, and it's something. I don't know what it is at that point. I made it be something later on, but anyway. Yeah. So I did that. Then I made up the gobbledygook stuff, and then the next day went back to work with Savik, who was Kirstie Alley. It was like her first thing in Hollywood, her first movie anyway. So I arrived at Paramount. Found the associate producer guy was kind of in charge of all this. And he said, in the first movie, they spoke a little bit of Vulcan, right? Because we just talked about that, because that scene with the Colin R and all that stuff. And I said, yeah. He said, your Vulcan should sound like that. And I said, now you thought of this. He says, let's go watch that. So we went and watched it, and this is all very primitive stuff. We watched it on a moviola. No one knows what a moviola is, right? It was a thing they used. It was a great big machine. You put a big reel of film, okay, and then you run it through a thing so you could watch it on the screen. But the film doesn't go on to another reel. It just goes into a trash can. And then you rewind it back onto the first reel. It's insane. And that's how they used to do. So anyway, so we're watching it, and I'm thinking, I'm going to listen to see what can I hear to make my language sound like this one in the first movie that does not affect lip movement that I already worked out. And what I heard from time to time was a kind of sound. I said, you can't see. Great. Let's put in a few here and there. So I added that in. So then we go to the sound stage. I met Kirstie Alley, and she and I kind of went aside to practice to say the lines. And I showed her how this word lined up with this original English word and stuff like that. And we're practicing and practicing. And the director of the film, who was Nick Meyer, right, pulls the producer aside. And on TV in the sitcoms, you go to the other side of the room and have a discussion as if the other people in the same room can't hear you. It was just like that. They went to the other side of the room as if no one else could hear them. And I heard that Nick Meyer say, I don't know if this Vulcan's going to work. And the producer said, why? What's the matter with it? And Nick said, I don't think Vulcan should sound like Yiddish. And what he was hearing was the that I just put in there, right? And the producer said, let's try it. Let's just try it, and if we don't like it, we'll rethink. Okay. So we went and did it. And it took a few takes because she had to match it. It was very weird to say this stuff and matching it. Actors do a lot of what's called looping, is adding the dialogue and matching their own lips because there was a sound problem or a performance problem or something like that.
Or ADR?
ADR, automatic dialogue replacement, or whatever that means. So they're used to that, but this was in a different language, so it was tricky. And the one line, it was maybe 4 or 5 syllables. We did it in 2 parts and stuff like that. Anyway, so we did it, but when we were done doing it, they played it back. Okay, well, Spock wasn't there. So Savik says something in Vulcan and Spock responds in English, and Savik says something in Vulcan and Spock responds in English. And Nick Meyer, the director, did something that I don't think I've ever seen anyone do before. He fell down on the floor laughing. He said, we'll keep it. Okay. couple of days later, it was Friday. I remember it was a Friday. Went back to do the same thing with Leonard Nimoy. I got there. I arrived on time. The engineer arrived on time and went up to his little engineer place. Leonard arrived on time, and whoever brings the donuts arrived on time. But there was nobody else there, so I'm in a room by myself with Mr. Spock and the donuts, right? And I figured, I know who he is. He doesn't know who I am. So I introduced myself. Oh, yeah. They told me you would be here. Show me what I have to do. So I'd written it out and gave him what I'd written out. And he looked at it. He said, oh, and I said it. And he kind of said it back. And he said, now, if we change this to this, will that still work as far as the lip syncing is concerned? I said, yeah. That what your suggestion didn't change anything. He said, let's do that. That'll be easier to. Okay, none of this means anything, so it didn't matter. Now, if we change this to this, will that work? No, that'll also have to lip sync. Okay, then we'll leave that alone. So everyone eventually showed up, and they asked me, we want to record this do this looping for another scene first, and then we'll get to your part. Okay, so I'm sitting there watching, and this is relevant, the scene they did. We'll come back to that in a second. Got to my thing, dubbed it in. That was the end of that. At that point, there was Oscar stuff to do. So I got in my car and I drove away, right, to go to the Oscar place, thinking I just taught Mr. Spock how to speak Vulcan, which I thought was very cool, and was absolutely convinced that this was fun, this was interesting from a movie point of view, this is interesting from a linguist's point of view. Maybe I'll be a footnote in a trivia book one day. And that's the end of that. On to the Oscars, right?
Did the Oscars go well?
The Oscars went fine. Bette Midler was kind of interesting, but yeah, the Oscars went fine. As was Miss Piggy, but that's another story.
Huh? Okay.
What was interesting about the scene, the first scene that they did before Leonard dubbed in his stuff, was at the time in 1982. There was rumors before the movie came out, right? There was rumors floating around that Spock dies in this movie. No one was sure, but there was rumors everywhere. And I heard the rumors. I don't know anything. I don't know the plot of this movie. I just know my one little scene. I didn't even know why they're having this conversation. So what the scene was, it took place on the bridge of a ship, okay? And there's the captain, who is Saavik, and Bones is there, and Spock is there, and some other people are there, and the Klingons are invading, and the Klingons fire something or other, and everyone on the ship gets hit and falls back, and Spock dies. And I'm watching, and what they were dubbing in is when Spock falls against the wall, he goes, Ugh. So they were trying some out. So he goes, so Leonard just goes, Ugh. And then eventually they picked one to dub in. And I was sitting there watching this, and I'm thinking, it's true. It's true. The rumors are all true, and I know something and nobody else knows. Wow! And I kept it a secret, didn't tell her. When I saw the movie, right? I went to see the movie, and I'm watching it. I think I was more fooled than anybody else when it turned out to be the Kobayashi Maru at the beginning of the film, and no one was killed and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, but that's why, to bring this full circle or something, that's why, we should talk about Klingon. Huh?
This is fine.
We're talking about
This is, yeah.
That's why they needed these lines dubbed into Vulcan in the first place. Okay, because with this Kobayashi Maru scene, there was all these rumors floating around that Spock is killed, and somehow a script got out. Okay, and so everyone knows that Spock is going to be killed. So what they did is, I don't know whether the Kobayashi Maru scene was originally part of the film, or if it was somewhere else in the movie.
I heard they added it in response to the rumors.
That may be. Okay, so the scene where the dubbing happened was filmed before that. And what the original lines were was Savik's, well, what the scene is Spock is in charge of the Enterprise and a new crew and all this stuff. And Kirk, who's Admiral Kirk, right, comes aboard to do an inspection. So he arrives on the ship and is greeted by Spock and Savik. And they have a little conversation. Then Kirk goes on his merry way to inspect the ship. Savik turns to Spock and says, in the original dialogue, "He's not what I expected." Right? And Spock says, "What did you expect?" "Well, he's so human." Well, we can't all be perfect, right? There's something like that. But that doesn't make any sense because once the Kobayashi Maru scene is in there, we know he's not what I expected implies that she's never met him before. Okay, but we know she has. So they changed that to he's never what I expect. Okay. Okay, and that was the sole reason that they had for doing it. Right, the rest of it made sense, but they changed the few lines a little bit to throw you off, so that the lips would be misdirection and stuff like that. Plus, they knew that if it didn't match exactly, you're reading the subtitles anyway. Instead of staring at, if you stare at their lips, it doesn't quite work. So read the subtitles instead. But that's why they made the change, because of this rumor about Spock being killed got out there. All right, that's that story.
Okay.
Thank you, Ethan. Yes.
So, in oh, I get a microphone. Yay! Hello, everyone who's online. So, in TKD, there are a number of words that are seem to be derived from TOS episodes with Klingons in them. And I was curious, how did you access those episodes? Was it your own VHS tapes? Was it something that you asked for, provided by?
Okay, this is in primitive times. It couldn't go to Memory Alpha or something or other.
That kind of segues, connects to a question someone asked if you were a Star Trek fan before you got involved in all of this. So
I'll answer that one first because that's faster. When Star Trek, the original series, was on TV originally, okay, is when I was in college. And at the time, people in college lived in the dorms, didn't have TVs, or not so much. Maybe somebody did, but mostly not. So I was aware of Star Trek, okay, but didn't see it every week or anything like that. Every once in a while, I'd catch it somewhere, and I liked it, but I didn't see it very often. So I got involved in it like everyone else in the reruns, and became a fan in that way. Yeah.
okay.
That was before you got involved.
Yeah.
So you were a Star Trek fan as much as Star Trek
not a big
fans
Star
existed,
Trek fan, right? But yeah. I hadn't seen all the episodes and stuff like
Not
that.
quite
Would watch it
Joe
when it first
Trimble
showed up.
level, but you know,
Would not be Joe Trimble.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, is okay. When it came time to do the dictionary. Well, I proposed to the powers that be at Paramount that I write this book. Because people seem to be, the filmmaking crews seem to be interested in the language, so I decided Star Trek fans would be interested in the language too, maybe. And maybe.
Just a little.
So let's say you write the book. Okay, so what I had for the book, for the dictionary part, not the grammar part, but for the dictionary part, it included all of the words that I made up for the film, whether they ended up in the film or not, because I made up stuff that never made it into the movie at all. Some lines got cut out, which is normal movie-making stuff. I also made up, when I was making up the Klingon dialogue, I made up Klingon versions of all the lines spoken by Klingons when they were speaking English to each other, not when they were speaking to Captain Kirk. When they were speaking English to each other, I made up Klingon versions of those, so that while we were filming, if someone said, "Hey, why is that guy talking English? He should be talking Klingon," I could say, "Here," as opposed to, "Oh, let me think about that," right? Okay, they used none of those things, but it did flesh out the grammar and the vocabulary somewhat. So the book was to include all of those words that were in the movie, all the words that were made up for the movie, whether they were, even if they weren't in the movie. It would have been a really skinny book. It would have been thinner than this program thing here. So I said, okay, I have to add some more words to it. What should these other words be? I can't just take, Webster's dictionary and make up all those words. Okay. There's two kinds of words. There's Star Trek words and non-Star Trek words. For the non-Star Trek words, I don't have a slice of how I decided what was going to be in there. It was obviously important to me to have a word for paperclip. I don't know why.
Just look around the office.
I don't. You know. So for the Star Trek words, okay, you was talking about Bijo. You know, Bijo made a book called the Star Trek Concordance, which was a list of all the episodes in the original series, and it was mimeographed or something originally. all the episodes and a little summary of them, and vocabulary. You know, the list of characters and stuff like that. So I had a hold of Bijo's thing, one of the versions of it, and just went through all the episodes that had Klingons in them, or where they referenced Klingons, because it's all indexed, her thing. And that's where the words came from. Okay, so I didn't go back to videotapes or anything like that. I couldn't have then. Yeah, she's still around.
But I think her husband passed.
Her husband passed away, but she's still there. Yeah. You're welcome.
Oh.
Yeah.
So does that mean that there is somewhere translated into Klingon all the lines that Klingon spoke, maybe in Lawrence's basement, a paper that has, you know, like the English sentences and Klingon for that?
It's in my basement. It's not in the basement. It's in my kitchen, actually. Yeah. Now, if you ask me to lay my hands on it, that's another issue, because I'm one of these people who, this is both good and bad. I don't throw out anything of that type. So I've got lots of papers with lots of stuff, but finding it is impossible. Right.
As long as you
Yeah.
usually throw a piece of paper on top of the date, it's a great filing system.
Just throw a newspaper in there every once in a while.
No, it's get it off of my desk, put it in a box, put it there. Yeah.
So, to be honest, I can't remember if I've asked you this before.
All right, I can't remember if I answered it, so that's we're fair.
And the POCbot lists editors, translated by, and reconstruction by, and concept by, but it never says who wrote it. So the question is, who wrote the POCbot, which is also involved with, was the English written first, and then you translated it into Klingon?
The English was written first.
Who wrote it?
This Dutch guy who wrote it in English, not in Dutch. Is his name not there?
Doesn't, is that for some keys?
Yeah.
Listen here.
Yeah.
Because the whole premise of that is yeah. That's who.
I have a question. I noticed that one of the new words, the atkham, which is yeast, and I guess it comes from the word yeast in English, I think also comes from phone, and like phone fungus. A friend of mine actually asked me, so how would you say sourdough in Klingon? Because that would be related. I thought, I would personally say natural yeast, the equivalent of natural yeast, but maybe there's a more proper way.
Yeah, put it on the touch.
Okay.
Right. That's a question for next year, yeah.
More questions from the room?
Malts in your basement for all these years.
Yes.
How did you even
Xbox, PS5.
Be on Discord.
How many cheese balls you go through?
There's in not throwing stuff out, I put a lot of stuff in the basement. So there's lots of things to keep him busy. I wish he would sort it out.
Okay.
Earlier today, we were talking about like the word traffic, and we hypothesized that he has seen a lot of American TV and could correlate things, or is he just isolated, like chained up and can't escape?
He's not chained up. I'm nice.
That's what we were. That's what we were saying.
He has immigration issues
Yeah.
that he needs to have dealt with.
Right.
So,
His favorite TV show is Nightclub.
Right.
So someone asked online, is there anything about Klingon that you did where you afterwards you thought this was genius and I love this and this is the best thing?
Huh.
Great question. Love it.
Usually they ask the other way around. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, if we ignore the interesting coincidences in the vocabulary.
Maybe in the grammar.
In the grammar,
you're like, this was so, like, you did it, you were like, wow, I've just done something.
I don't know. I don't know. Can't answer that one. Yeah.
We've heard that you do a lot, you put a lot of that, pick one for column A, one for column B, find features in other languages, and pick those, make something like that in Klingon. Are there any pieces of Klingon that you just invented out of nothing?
I invented a lot of it out of nothing. And in what you're talking about, picking from other languages, I wasn't intentionally picking from other languages. If you study linguistics, you learn about a lot of, not to speak necessarily, but you learn about lots of languages. So look, ideas are floating around, and I said, I've got to, do something. Oh, there's this. I don't know where it came. Oh, yeah, that came from this language, but that's not why I picked it. Right, so it wasn't intentionally I wanted something from Navajo or something like that. But that's how they do that. I do that and then stop doing that, and stuff like that. The word order I sort of made up. I mean, that was intentional. The base, the subject, object, verb, word order. Well, not that order, not the order I just said. It comes in a different order. That was a linguistic trick, not borrowing from another language trick. So if that counts as something I just made up.
Hello.
Back to the Oscars. So when you were saying how a lot of the questions were already written, you had a script that's already typed all in there. So then as people win, is that when you find out also at the same time? And then
When I say it's scripted, it's legit. The Oscars are legit. The script goes up to, and the Oscar goes to, then it's blank.
And then you type it in, and then it pops up, or
Yeah. The way we did it is we had pre-programmed, and the Oscar goes to. This is a long time ago. It's better now. We had a system that had 5 names. The 5 nominees were in there. And the Oscar goes to Tom Cruise. He's number 3. Hit 3 in Tom Cruise. Yeah, right. And then after that, that's when it was really, really live. Yeah.
And the winner is?
I'm not sure when it changed. Yeah, I'm not sure when it changed.
Is one. What type of comments do you like to hear from random people talking about the Klingon language?
Compliments.
Compliments? That sounds like a good answer.
No, what I like to hear what people have done with it, because everybody, I'm pointing at the computer, has done such brilliant things with this language. To me, it's unbelievable, the kinds of stuff you guys are doing. And I never ever thought, I never thought anyone was going to pay any attention to it at all. I mean, and why did you write a book? Well, when I wrote I've said this before, when I wrote the book, I thought what would happen with it. I hoped what would happen with it. Some people would buy it because when you write a book, that's nice. But I thought what would happen is people would buy it, kind of thumb through it, riff through it. Well, here's an interesting thing. Oh, here's the word for this. Here's the word for that, and put it on the table. And every once in a while, pick it up and look at it. And that's it. That's what I really, really thought was going to happen with it. Huh?
It was poorly down.
Yeah. And I didn't know, I honestly, truly did not know that anything above and beyond that was happening until I got contacted by Lawrence, which was after the second edition came out. I mean, after the white one came out, which was 92. And Lawrence, I don't know how he contacted, I don't know, he's not here. I don't know whether he called me or maybe email was invented already. I don't remember. But he got in touch and introduced himself as the head of something called the Klingon Language Institute. And I said, what's that? And he told me there's these people who are studying Klingon and da-da-da-da-da. And I go, what? That's the first time I heard that it was beyond, a coffee table book. Yeah.
Oh, wait. Did you not want to talk at a convention prior to that? Some crazy guy started asking you questions going on
Prior to
Lawrence contacting you, prior to the White Dictionary coming, prior to there being a KLI.
That was you, huh?
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
We had a mailing list, and I deliberately schlepped down to wherever this convention was, because the mailing list had accumulated a whole bunch of questions, grammar questions. And I went to see you specifically.
So I could avoid answering them, right? No, I knew the book was selling. I mean, I've told this story before, but I knew the book was selling because they did the second one. Yeah,
but they were like 500,000 copies sold or something like that.
500,000, I wish.
250,000.
Yeah.
Some crazy number.
Yeah. The original book came out in 84, 85. It was December, January, so it was right there on the cusp, somewhere in there. And it sold, I get royalty statements, so it sold okay. And there was I was telling somebody this earlier here. There was a Star Trek convention that I went to after the book came out. And I figured, and the reason I was invited is because I worked on the film, but also because of the book. And I figured someone's going to want an autograph in this book. So I gave some thought to what I should write in Klingon in the book, so I didn't have to pause and ponder, every time someone came with a book. Thought of something. I had my little autograph session, and the first guy in line gave me his copy of the little blue book, and I signed whatever I signed and gave it back. Thank you very much. And he went away. And as soon as he was gone, I said, "Oh no, I goofed. I made a mistake. Oh well, he's gone." Next person came, I signed it, I signed it right. Next person came, I signed it right. After a little while, the first guy came back. And he said, "I've been looking through the book. I've been looking at what you signed. I can't make any sense out of this." And I said, "That's because I made a mistake. I'll tell you what, I have some some other copies of the book. You give me yours, and I'll give you this clean one, and I'll write correctly in it." He said, "No way." Yeah. So I knew, I knew there was interest, but I didn't know it was this kind of interest. Yeah.
Do you know who that was?
No. He was dressed like the prisoner, that show, The Prisoner? Yeah, he was dressed with that coat with the white thing. Yeah. So if he shows up dressed like that.
Yeah, right. Then we'll know who it is. So another question was, as a linguist, what's the most interesting weird feature in the grammar of any language you've come across? Interesting to you.
Of any language?
You've come across that you've worked with.
Navajo is pretty cool.
Weird features.
Yeah. Because, it has. No, I'm pausing because the details are interesting. The general concept occurs in other languages too. But they have a system of classification the way Chinese or something does. So different nouns fall in different classes, and when you count them, you have to use the right thing. They have a similar kind of thing, but it's based on the verb. Okay, so I'm grossly oversimplifying here, and therefore it's probably not quite right. But the verb you use to say, "I pick up the stick," is a different verb from "I pick up the ball." but it's the same verb as I dropped the stick. It's the same verb as the stick is lying there. Okay? Because the verb means to move in the way a long skinny thing does, or something like that. And affixes say up, down, away, not moving at all, stuff like that. That's pretty cool.
End of our time. Does anybody here have any last question?
In an air, no.
Or a bookstore, you've been to a bookstore and you're just like, oh, this copy of my book, let me sign it, put it back on.
No, but I did. I was in a used bookstore in some funny place in Virginia, in small town in Virginia. Wandered into the used bookstore, just looking around here and there, and either there was a Star Trek section or something, and there was a copy of my book. It was the blue one, not the original one. The original one had a rough embossed cover, and then they reissued it with the shiny cover. It was the shiny cover one. And it was for 50 cents or something. And I said, I'm going to buy that. So I did. So I went and I picked that book and I went to buy it. And the clerk said, oh, I knew someone would buy this one of these days. So I did that. But it's funny you mentioned about the airport, because when the book was new, shortly after the book came out, there was a big, I don't know if convention is the right word, a big meeting of linguists who study American Indian languages. In California, it was in Santa Cruz. And there was people from all over the country, all over the world, but mostly from all over the US and Canada who were there. And if you were in the field that I was in, like, that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so, and everybody was there who was anybody in this field, right? And the thing went about 4 days. All kinds of stuff going on. And in the middle of it, there was a banquet. And we're in the banquet hall, this big room above a merry-go-round, if I remember right. But anyway, and I went up to the bar to get a beer or something. And a woman comes up and introduces herself as she's had her name. She said she teaches at UCLA. Okay, and she said, you're Marc Okrand, right? Yeah. You wrote that Klingon dictionary, right? Yeah. I need to tell you something. I'm thinking, uh-oh. Okay, I've sullied the field or something. Right? And she said, don't laugh. I'm very serious. Okay, she said, I just want to tell you how great it is that there's now a real linguistics book that you could buy at an airport. She's gone on to teach classes in Klingon at UCLA. So, wow. Yeah. There's that classes at universities. You know this.
I've been a guest lecturer.
Ah, yeah.
Well, I think we are now out of time, unfortunately. Someone did ask briefly, and I know we spoke about that earlier, who did you have the most fun with filming stuff in Klingon?
Probably Christopher Lloyd.
Okay.
If for no other reason than he was first.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, since then it was so I didn't know what I was doing, you know. With he didn't know what he was doing either, so it was fair, you know. So we learned together. You know.
Who was the person you talked about last? Do you remember the name of that lady?
The name of
that you were just talking about?
Christopher Lloyd?
No. The person who went on to teach.
Pamela Monroe.
Pamela Monroe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, is there some UCLA person on there?
No, someone just was like, who was the person you talked about last?
Yeah.
That's okay. I think we are done at this point.